Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today we're going to be talking about defensive fighting. Also, if you would like to see your own footage featured on the channel, you can send me an email in the description. I'm putting this part at the beginning because my analytics say none of you people watch this shit past 30 seconds, and I'm running out of footage to talk about. So, as I said, we're going to talk about defensive fighting. And defensive fighting, in my opinion, basically comes with three caveats. The first, meaning that you have to make sure to parry and know when to be defensive versus when to be offensive. Because somebody who fights entirely in the knock or entirely on the defense is going to lose, because very quickly your opponent is going to understand that that's all you're going to do, and they're going to start throwing the most wacky stuff possible just to get a hit in. The second caveat is that most defense comes from footwork. And despite the fact that I'm going to talk at length about the kinds of techniques that you're going to be doing, in reality, none of these work if your feet aren't where they need to be. And the third caveat is that actually most of defense comes from having a good offense in the first place. And so kind of going back to point one, if you're only defensive, everyone's going to know what's going on and they're not going to play your game. So having a good defense usually requires that your opponent either be wary of you for whatever reason, or that you have thrown attacks in the past that have caused them, to take a step back for a second. So in a lot of ways, being a defensive fighter is a lot about just knowing when to switch on that defense mode to deal with something that you're experiencing. So with that, we're going to watch the clip. So basically what happens here is French on the left throws a flurry of attacks. I sit and wait for my opening and throw my lower right Zwerchau after my opponent misses a thrust. So there's a couple of components at play here that cause this to work. The first is distance. If you watch this carefully, every single time my opponent throws an attack and moves their front foot forward, you will see my back foot go backwards a equal amount of distance. Despite the fact that my front foot is not moving forward, and this can somewhat be a problem if he had attacked my leg, the real reason here is that you see as I move my back leg backwards, my torso, my body, my head, it all moves backwards at about the same rate as my opponent moves forward. You will also see that as my opponent extends their leg and extends their hand, the sword is extending with it. So this is a well-timed attack, but it's still not quite enough to reach me, despite the fact that if you look at where I was here and you look at where this attack lands, it would have pretty much reached me. This happens 2-3 times in a row. Every single time an attack gets thrown, including this one towards the hands, which is being blocked right now, it either lands on my guard or it hits nothing but air. And the reason for this, again, is because I am moving backwards every single time my opponent throws an attack until this thrust. So I've mentioned before that whenever you miss a thrust, you end up usually overcommitting more than you think. And that's because thrusting, unlike cutting, requires you to extend the tip on the basically actionable part of your sword well past your target, as you can see here. This is a good 3-4 inches past where my chest is. Whereas if you were throwing a cut at my head, it wouldn't need to be that committed. Also, in order to throw a thrust with commitment, you have to push your body and your momentum forward to try to catch people who are moving backwards. Because just touching them on the chest with your point is not enough, whereas just tapping them with the cut is actually, in a lot of cases, more than enough. So the reason I do not step backwards with this one is because I want my opponent to miss the thrust. And because I make them miss the thrust by standing exactly where I am, I ensure that they are sufficiently overcommitted that I can safely throw my low right Zwerch under their arm and catch them in the opening where they weren't expecting it. So going all the way back to beginning, if you watch the footwork carefully, you see that maintain distance, close distance with their footwork, and then throw the defensive cut. So the next thing to look at here is the blade work that I'm using, and specifically the guard. And if you watch this clip, I do all of my defensive work out of this position, which I'm going to call cron. Technically speaking, you can't really call this a cron. That was because I think most translations put cron meaning crown and crown meaning, at the level of your head. But overall, the purpose of this is that by having my crossguard horizontal, I'm pretty much keeping myself safe from any descending cuts to my hands, torso, head. And with the backwards motion, I'm making it a little bit difficult to target my hands without me being able to just tilt my crossguard in one direction or the other and protect even, the horizontal plane of my hands. So as these attacks come in, you'll see me just more or less keep my sword exactly where it is, tapping the opponent every single time on his sword as he comes forward, waiting for that one committed attack that's going to reach me despite the fact that I'm moving backwards, which of course in this case is the thrust. Because despite the fact that I'm still in this cron, I'm engaged in a bind, and as he thrusts forward, it's pretty easy for me, as you can kind of see here faintly. I tilt my sword a little bit to my left, and I raise my hands a little bit to catch his blade in my cross. And by that time, he has already missed. So from right here, he's engaging in a strong versus weak bind. As he thrusts in, it requires virtually no pressure from me to push that thrust off to the side and keep myself safe. So the defensive cron works this way because it can defend you meaningfully from cuts and thrusts, and most importantly, engage in a center line bind whenever your opponent decides to commit to something. So if we watch one of these other exchanges and just pretend for a second that this, for example, was the bind that my opponent committed to and tried to just ram that thrust in forward, I again would have a very dominant bind. If we look at the next cut, same thing. He went for an attack on my hands. It got caught in my crossguard. If he decided to try to ram this in for whatever reason, he would be in a very disadvantageous bind. And of course, the last one with the thrust, another disadvantageous bind. This happens because when you're in a cron, there isn't a lot of places to bind except on the strong or on the crossguard. That's because any descending cut is going to get trapped right down in here, and any thrust is going to have to move past the strong part of my blade, which I'm using kind of as a shield in front of my deep targets. The other thing that makes the cron so successful when paired with backwards motion is that as you're moving backwards, your opponent has to overextend a little bit more maybe than they expected just to reach your body. And now that you've moved backwards, they're far more likely to just hit your blade in, a fashion where you don't really have to be blocking or parrying anything that's coming at you. You just have to stay right there and wait for your moment. And the final aspect of this is the part where I stand still and let the thrust go past. And what this really has to do with defensive fighting is knowing when to pick your attack that you're going to throw a riposte off of. So obviously I could have tried to throw a riposte off of any of these attacks that I successfully parried. But the issue is that for every step I move backwards, I am just as similarly out of range as my opponent, which means if I threw something here, chances are my opponent could have parried it just as easily as I was parrying what he was throwing. So I had to wait for a moment where the range closed distance. But instead of waiting for that moment, I created that moment, again, by standing still and letting that thrust go past. And this is again where we talk about thrusts and how missed cuts are often very hard to riposte off of, because most people, again, when they either miss a cut by hitting you on your crossguard or miss by just hitting nothing but air, are always thinking about that next step. They're thinking about that next parry and that next cut that's coming after. So oftentimes you're at that maximum range and that maximum distance, and the riposte that you throw off of a missed cut just doesn't have any real opening to seek. The other person is already planning out their next few steps, and you can often fall into a bit of a trap trying to riposte every single thing that comes your way. So I wait for this thrust because I know thrusts are always going to be more committed than cuts, and specifically that I know that because of the bind I put myself in and I put my opponent in, that I would have a very easy time once I parried this to just immediately go into my riposte, and I could put it pretty much anywhere I wanted. You see the distance here is significantly close to the point where I could hit the leg, head, arm, body, anything that I really want with any technique that I want. And what that means is that my opponent now has no idea what's coming next and has to just kind of take a guess. And that guess in this case was that I was going to close in and grapple, but of course I threw that spheric low and I hit the point that he guessed differently from. He guessed high, I went low. So that's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send me an email over at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.